The Federal Vision is a loosely aligned movement within Reformed theology. The movement itself began in 2002. There was a conference held at the Auburn Avenue Presbyterian Church that was titled The Federal Vision. Now, after that conference, there was a bit of controversy discussed over the various issues that were mentioned at that conference. And if we're going to boil down the central tenet of what is considered to be, the Federal Vision movement or Federal Vision theology, it is the notion of the objectivity of the covenant. And so the Federal Vision is distinguished by several differences between the proponents of the movement and traditional Reformed theology, particularly surrounding the objectivity of the covenant, which plays itself out in various ways. So some of the things that become distinctive of this movement are, one, that they believe that all those who are baptized are objectively part of the new covenant. And some people have said this is a form of baptismal regeneration. Proponents of the Federal Vision confess, for example, that if you are baptized, you are united to Christ, and that is part of being in the new covenant. There's been a distinction in some writers between being covenantally elect, for example, and being decretally elect. While traditional Reformed theology talks about election in terms of the eternal decree of God unto salvation, the Federal Vision believes also that there is a sense in which one is covenantally elect, or one is considered part of the elect if they are in the church, which occurs through the sacrament of baptism. This leads then to other understandings of things like apostasy, for example. And so this is an attempt to deal with certain biblical passages that talk about real apostasy, that someone really can fall away indeed from the faith or fall away from Christ. And so this notion of the objectivity of the covenant then means that one can, in fact, in some sense, be united to Christ and then fall away. And this also sometimes changes the meaning of terms like regeneration. Some don't speak about a personal regeneration only for the elect, but instead talk about a more corporate regeneration, or the church and the new covenant as the regeneration that one is incorporated into through baptism. This also has led to other views about remaining within the covenant and what it means to remain faithful to the covenant, which some have argued leads to a different view of justification as well as final salvation. And so the notion in Federal Vision is that you have to remain faithful to the covenant that you are incorporated into. If you are not faithful to that covenant, then you are removed from it. You are cut off from Christ. Now, the proponents of Federal Vision, by and large, do not reject traditional notions of sola fide or justification by faith alone, though the opponents of the Federal Vision movement have claimed this. Now, popular proponents of the Federal Vision include, for example, John Barrick, Peter Leithart, James Jordan, Douglas Wilson, and Steve Schlissel at one time, though he is not necessarily part of the movement anymore. These are some of the figures that have traditionally been associated with the Federal Vision. Recently, however, there has been kind of a split or divide among the proponents of this movement, and it's not clear whether one can really even consistently talk about a Federal Vision movement as a whole in any sense. There are some who have aligned themselves with each other in particular theological stances. For example, James Jordan and Peter Leithart and the work that they have done with the Theopolis Institute. But Douglas Wilson, who was initially considered one of the foremost proponents of the Federal Vision movement, has now declared that he is no longer part of that movement. And there was at one time a distinction between different forms of a Federal Vision theology. One would say that it is the Federal Vision Dark and one is the Federal Vision Light. The Federal Vision Dark would include the likes of people like Peter Leithart and James Jordan, and the Federal Vision Light would include people like Douglas Wilson. But that in recent years has seemingly changed. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding the Federal Vision among proponents of Reformed theology. There have been statements made by the OPC, the PCA, and the URCNA condemning certain aspects of the Federal Vision movement. The URCNA actually condemned the Federal Vision as heresy. So some pretty harsh charges coming toward the federal vision from that particular movement. Now, some smaller Reformed denominations have also made statements about the federal vision, condemning them as well as teaching heresy. Now, the claims against federal vision have to do with things like justification by faith. One of the criticisms is that the beliefs of the federal vision are against a traditional understanding of justification by faith alone. One of the other criticisms is that the federal vision movement believes in what is called a mono-covenantal view, meaning that God's dealings are through the lens of covenant, but through a singular covenant of grace that extends all the way back from the beginning through the end of time. Traditional Reformed theology, on the other hand, has argued that there are two covenants, or what is called bicovenantalism, which is a covenant of works, which is the case with Adam in the garden, and sometimes said to be reiterated through the Mosaic covenant, though there's quite a bit of debate on that point, as well as the covenant of grace. But for the federal vision proponents, there is only one covenant, hence the name monocovenantalism. Other arguments against the federal vision from traditional Reformed theology are that they reject a traditional view of the Reformed doctrine of election by introducing this idea of a covenantal election as well. It's also been argued that they hold to a more Lutheran view of both sacramental theology as well as a more Lutheran view of apostasy, speaking instead of traditional Reformed theology, talking about one being cut off from Christ or united to Christ and then with the ability to actually fall away. Some other criticisms have been leveled against particular proponents of the federal vision who have differing views from each other, dealing with the issue of final justification that is not simply sola fide, but that also includes one's faithfulness within it. Also criticized are ideas by some proponents that the law does not require perfect obedience. It's often been said that the federal vision and the new perspective on Paul have some similar ideas. And these two ideas are often confused with one another, and it's not quite the case that federal vision proponents are simply reiterating the new perspective on Paul, though there are areas of overlap in their understanding, such as the idea that personal salvation has been overemphasized in understandings of Paul, as well as the notion of a kind of second justification that includes faithfulness, not faith alone in the traditional sense. So today, the federal vision movement is still remains one that is embroiled in controversy. However, the controversy seems to have died down to an extent. The majority of the traditional Reformed denominations do not allow for federal vision, at least in many of its forms, anymore. But there are still proponents who hold to what would be known as federal vision theology. I don't think they tend to use this label anymore as much as they did at one time. But it is still a distinctive theological movement. And like any distinctive theological movement, it still is in the process of shaping itself. It's only been around since 2002, and in the past 16 years there have been many developments dealing with things like paedo-communion, or communion that is offered to infants, which is another point of contention within the Reformed world. And over the years, this movement has defined itself, but some have also been excluded or left the movement as it continues to refine itself. And today, I'm not sure, as I said, that one can really identify specifically a federal vision movement. It might more be the case that Peter Leithart and those in the Theopolis Institute identify more so with what they call Reformation Catholicism, and those identified with Doug Wilson more so speak of themselves in terms of being classical postmillennialists and some other theological categories, rather than identifying themselves strictly as federal vision. All right, if you liked this, check out the other videos in this series, the Theology Video Encyclopedia. The goal of this series, if you don't know and you haven't watched the other ones in it, is to just give a brief overview within 5 to 15 minutes of various theological topics and movements, not to critique or to defend any of them, but simply to define what they are. Thanks for watching. God bless.